Acts 27 and 28. Well, some 60 verses are dedicated to this voyage between Caesarea and Rome, so Luke must have considered it important, and my suspicions are it's just that he wanted us to experience this trip with him. He was one of the travelers with Paul as well. I'm going to begin by just reading out of Ben Witherington's commentary. There were no passenger ships as we know them in antiquity. Most travelers on large vessels simply booked passage on as deck passengers, sleeping in the open or under a small tent. They would travel with bags, which would contain not only clothes but also cooking ware, food, bathing items, and sometimes bedding as well. In general, ships never left on a fixed schedule, but according to the winds and the weather, which meant that if one wished to go on such a ship, one needed to stay near the port, where one would hear the herald signal departure. Also, sailors, like many others in the Roman world, were a superstitious lot, and there were certain days when it was thought unwise to sail. Most ship captains or owners would make a sacrifice before sailing, and if the omens were ill, sailing would be delayed. One had to go while the going was good, and one could never be sure of making a passage by a certain date, unless one made allowance for some delaying factor. The most expeditious, large, and reliable of all the ships were the grain ships that made the run from Alexandria to Rome with as few stops as possible. One of the biggest, the Isis, was 180 feet long, 45 feet wide, and a hold 44 feet deep, holding close to 1,000 tons of grain, and nearly that many passengers as well. By comparison, Paul, in this story we hear today, sailed on a medium-sized craft that carried close to 300 passengers. A little bit farther along, there were some 11 or 12 accounts of Paul throughout the book of Acts traveling to some destination by sea. Taken together, these accounts suggest that Paul covered some 3,000 miles on the sea during his near 3 decades of ministry between Acts 9 and 28. By the time we get to Paul's journey to Rome, he is a well-seasoned sea traveler and knows the dangers of sailing during the middle to late part of the fall. He even knows how to cope with a crisis at sea. So this is a travel log, as we'll see in Acts 27 and 28. They take off. This is on 27 verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon. They took off from Caesarea and are going to run along the shore. They stopped at Sidon, where a man, the Roman guard, apparently named Julius, treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty. So right off the bat, we notice that Paul is being treated very well by the Roman guard that has been assigned to this trip. Verses 5 and 6, we came to Myra, and that's on the southern coast of Asia. And they'll be moving along the coast, as we heard. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy and put us on board. So he changes ships. This is where he'll be with 75 others. And they sail this way, and they end up landing at a city called Fair Havens. 27:8. They came to a place called Fair Havens, which is on the south coast of the island of Crete, near the city of Lasea. They ported here, and Paul, at this point, it's probably late October, and Paul has advised them, and we hear him say, "I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives." This was simply Paul's advice. He was not talking prophetically by any means. And so he was wanting to winter here, Paul thought, for 3 months, but no, they wanted to winter on the western edge coast of Crete. So they got back in the boat, and that's when the trouble started. 27:15. So when the ship was caught by the wind and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. So who knows the path they followed, but it turns out that for 14 days they will be being pushed by severe wind. And the ship did take a pounding. The cargo was thrown overboard. The general mood on board was that they had lost all hope, and for about 14 days, as we read, they did not think they would make it. Paul was visited by a messenger spirit, he says, and he told the crew down in the hold of the ship that no one would die if they simply stuck with the ship. They finally started to approach land. They didn't know where they were, of course, and the bow of the ship got stuck, and the stern was beaten into pieces by the waves, and everyone did what they could to get to shore, some swimming, some holding on to pieces of the ship. And they crawl aboard a small 8 by 18 mile island called Malta. We're about 130 miles north of North Africa. We are about 50 miles south of Sicily here, the island of Sicily. And by the way, it just shows again that God can be providentially in control of a situation, even if miracles are not part of it. God did not, calm the sea, but he certainly kept people alive. And it also tells us that once again, who knows how many times this happened. I imagine as Paul climbs onto the island, here we go once again, he had absolutely nothing but what was left on his back. He was willing to forego all earthly treasures for this ministry. Well, they built a fire, remember, and a snake comes out and bites Paul. The villagers think that Dike is that is the name of the goddess they gave to the idea of justice, Dike, and that's the virgin daughter of Zeus. They thought that Dike had gotten a hold of Paul or was going to get back at Paul for something he had done wrong. And then, of course, because Paul doesn't die, they turn around and do the opposite. They think he's a god. So it's interesting, again, in that worldview, how quickly they can imagine that they're standing in front of a god in human flesh. It would be then 3 months before they take off again. So they do winter here. Instead of here, they spend the winter here, and it'll be probably February before they decide to head north. Rome is up here at the very top. And they finally do take off, and they land at a city called Puteoli, and that leaves them about a 130-mile walk up to Rome. So they land, they make port, and on their walk, and it's not very far outside of, in fact, it's called the City of Three Inns, that they meet some Roman Christians that come out to meet Paul. He's almost treated like a celebrity, or at least a dignitary at this point. Remember, he has written from Corinth, he has written the letter of Romans, so that precedes him. And so they come out to meet him some 50 miles outside of the city. And what is odd is that this is the way the book of Romans or Acts ends. We are allowed, we hear that Paul is allowed to basically live by himself in a rented home, guarded by a Roman soldier. He's able to take in visitors as much as he wishes. Nothing is ever said here or elsewhere about Paul's trial in Rome. We don't even know if he ever stood before a Roman magistrate. What is likely is that the charges were simply considered so weak that no one from Jerusalem made the trip all the way out here to prosecute Paul, and that was a requirement by Roman law. So it does seem that Paul was never found guilty of the charges that he had been having hang over his head for some 4 years now. 2 years again spent in Caesarea prison, and now 2 more years will be spent in a house arrest here before apparently he was let go. The narrative that we're given in Acts at the end of it is though Luke, the writer, knows that some event happens after those 2 years, otherwise he wouldn't have mentioned 2 years. But then again, Luke never tells us what does happen. So our suspicion is that Paul's case was dismissed. Paul continued his missionary activity in Italy. And again, that he went to Gentiles. We sense that in the speech he gives at the end of Acts 28 verse 28. And it will be 2 years from here. This is AD 62 that he is now in Rome at the end of the book of Acts. And what we know from church history and from a bit of tradition as well is that Paul will die as a martyr some 2 years from now.